Headlines, thanks Lisa. Heavy rain, snow and gale force winds are keeping key routes closed across Te Waipounamu, the South Island. Waka Kotahi says motorists should be aware of the dangers of surface water, rising river levels, fallen trees and slips. And Auckland Council has received 116 emergency call-outs after heavy rain. An Auckland General Practitioner says Health Minister Andrew Little's refusal to call the current healthcare situation a crisis shows he is out of touch. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7.
We're celebrating 50 years of Te Matatini, the foremost Māori performing arts festival and national kapahaka competition in the world. Join me, Julia Wilcox, and Rob Ruha, the music director of Te Matatini 50 album. We'll discuss and play some of the best and most famous Māori waiata over the past 50 years. Sunday, after the 1 p.m. news, here on RNZ National.
Tukia te papa kia hikara ta tātou ahi, he ahi tūtata, he ahi whitewhita, he ahi tautau, i ngā kaupapa kei te pai kōrero o Party People. Ko Mihingarangi ahau, nei mai ki te ahi kāro o ngā take whaitikanga o te wā. Welcome to Party People, brought to you by the Public Interest Journalism Fund. It's Tuesday, the 12th of July, and this week, Manu Tuarangi has come to the party. He put the me in Mihingarangi, he put the Bass and Ambassador for the Pacific Economic Development, and he put the zeal in the New Zealand First. He is the second smartest Shane in New Zealand politics after our friend Shane Te Pau, no mai. Tahu te mai Shane Jones, tēnā koe.
Kia ora, tēnā no tātou katoa. Pleasure to be here.
Most people will know you as a former New Zealand politician. So you began in Labour, then you joined New Zealand First. You served 3 terms with the New Zealand Labour Party, and more recently New Zealand First, where you were the Minister for Infrastructure, Forestry and Regional Development. It's great to have you here. What have you been up to?
Yes, well, after I salved my wounds of being made unemployed by the New Zealand electorate, however, them's the breaks when you stand in public life. No, back up in Taitokerau. Actually, recently I went to Raro to celebrate with my wife and whānau her 50th birthday. So after having made a positive contribution to their GDP, almost broke the credit card, back to the takurua, the cold and anu Aotearoa.
How are they coping with COVID? They've got a pretty high vaccination rate, eh?
Yeah, no, well into the 90s. They are struggling with staff. A situation where quite a few Kiwi businesses saw their staff as an easy option in the freezing works and other places. But look, the environment is very pleasing. The facilities are still much to the standard that Kiwis would expect and enjoy. And they hold New Zealand passports, so it's a great place to go and spend putea.
Kia ora, Shane Te Pau. I have to call you Shane Te Pau now, so everyone knows who I'm talking to. Have you got a good Shane Jones story?
I've got lots of good Shane Jones stories, but not to most of them will not be discussed on this show. I can assure you of this. This is not our first party together. Hey, but I can tell you this: I was on this list selection panel when Shane first stood, and I nominated him on the list. And I think we got you at 8. You were the Prime Minister's parachute at the time, weren't you? Helen Clark actually were in opposition. She was the parachute, and I can tell you without a word of a lie, a senior politician who's still around today come up to me afterwards and said, Shane Te Pau, we're going to regret this. We're going to regret this. But I had no regrets. I thought that Shane was a very good minister, particularly under New Zealand First. I see that the mahi that he did, and particularly in the infrastructure, and there are places that are humming economically, even though we've had COVID times, that would not be at that stage that they are if it wasn't for the putea that was spent and justified.
I was going to say, the people in the regions won't be regretting having their $3 billion. Let's talk about the PM. She's been visiting Australia, and commentators note the relationship between Ardern and Albanese feels much more aligned. She's told reporters herself that there's been a significant shift in policy and a return to fairness. So a nod from the Australians that they'll look at the concerns around 501s, some relief flood funding for the New Zealanders living in New South Wales, and an easier pathway to citizenship by Anzac Day next week. So Shane Jones, a good outcome for our Australian whananga?
You know what our Prime Minister is addressing is arguably New Zealand's greatest foreign affairs policy fiasco, snafu. Phil Goff, Helen Clark should never have backed down to the Aussies when the Aussies made Kiwis second-class citizens in Australia back in that period between 1999 and 2002. I can't think of a worse screw-up for a foreign policy snafu amongst two countries that are meant to be brothers in arms. And the fact that the 501 fiasco is now, kaupapa has now been addressed by the Prime Minister, I mean, that's positive for the people involved. But I do think if you make the pathway for Kiwis to become Aussie citizens, you are arguably opening the door for more people to leave New Zealand and become Aussie citizens. One of the reasons why a lot of Kiwis, in my view, have been a bit reluctant to head off en masse across the Tasman is they know that their rights are very insecure over there. So the moment that you do improve their rights so that they rival what they enjoy in New Zealand, there's every prospect we'll see a major migration.
Shane's talking about Helen Clark, Phil Goff, but wasn't John Key involved in that as well?
Well, afterwards he didn't fix it, and it's taken 30 odd years to fix. Shane is right that this is a double-edged coin. It might lead to many of our people going over to Australia, and but you know what? It is an injustice that did need to be fixed. Shane, people couldn't get benefits, people couldn't get student loans, no matter how long they've been in Australia. And the simple analysis is this: Kiwis that live in Australia give a hell of a lot more from the Australian economy than what they take. So I think it's only right that the injustice has been fixed.
Yeah, it was a situation, Mihi, where you pay tax without representation.
Yes.
Remember the underlying impulse of the Boston Tea Party when the Americans sought revolutionary freedom from the British. Same thing. So, no, I don't think I should be churlish. Good on Jacinda for improving those prospects, but it does come with a
what do you do to combat that situation, the loss of more New Zealanders to Australia, where you make the conditions better?
Well, the challenge is to improve wages, reduce the cost of living insofar as the cost of houses in New Zealand. And as a country, we have been niggardly and very parsimonious in respect of the amount of putea the Crown has put into infrastructure. Our population grew remarkably rapidly, a million people in just over 12, 15 years. And if you track the arrival of those migrants, we did not grow the resilience or the robustness of our infrastructure. And sadly, we're paying for it now.
Yeah, Shane is right, but also, it is the lucky land, isn't it, Shane, where basically their mines are in the middle of nowhere. They often don't have to dig, so they've got that supports the economy. But I think there's two things that underpin the difference between Australia and New Zealand, and one of them is wages, and they have a fair pay agreements, and they always have for the last 30, 40 years in Australia, and they have a very good superannuation program. I think it's gone up to 12%. And here's the good thing about the Australians: they don't stuff around with their superannuation program. It underpins their economy, and they use that as they do other mechanisms to invest in their infrastructure. And Shane is right, we've been very poor in generational support in terms of our infrastructure.
Yeah, we've got a crisis in the cost of living here at the moment, and you talk about the raising the income and things like that. But one thing that that the government is looking at is the supermarket, duopoly. Yeah. And so David Clark has announced a supermarket watchdog and a code of conduct. Do you think it's enough?
Well, I took the cudgels up in 2014. Yes. It was actually after John Key went to Australia, and the Australian supermarkets had decided to delist Kiwi products. And a number of Kiwis came to see me about this, so I went into Parliament at great risk, I might say, because some of the most well-heeled Kiwis are owners of supermarkets. And anyhow, took on the kaupapa. The Tories at that time weren't interested. And good on David Clark for working with Catherine Rich, former MP, the advocate for the Grocery Council. Bear in mind that the supermarkets are 50% owned by Woolworths, and that's Countdown, and the rest are a collective independent owners of supermarkets. And to the extent that a new grocery regulator can bring fairness, it's going to depend whether or not the rules are enforceable. If the rules, Mihi, are enforceable, and you can go to the High Court and you can get an injunction, or you can force people responsible for egregious behaviour to suffer a financial penalty, then you'll get the supermarkets to change their ways.
Shane Tepo, have you seen the finer details on that? Is that going to be able to happen?
I've seen some of the details, and some of it hasn't been released yet. I think it is a step in the right direction. Remember, every year they have to. There's a level of transparency, and which is quite a big thing to ask of a private organisation. And then, of course, they can be fined. What will have to happen is they will have to choose a real mongrel in terms of who will adjudicate that. And also, just today, we've seen many of the supermarkets give away or move towards allowing others to build on their land, because these supermarkets are not just about kai, they're about property and property ownership. So that's being loosened a bit. Here's the thing, though: this will not deal with the immediate crisis that we have in terms of cost of living.
Yes, no, it's
it
not
will
coming
take
through
a
to
good year
2023.
or so to kick in.
Will there be any kickback from Australia with us, toughening up?
No, I don't think there will be at all. They themselves have a problem. Look, in New Zealand, we've got monopolies, okay? The supermarkets are a type of monopoly. Now, you can get technical, and two monopolies equal a duopoly. And then we have similar situations with the cost of fuel, the cost of building products, our banking system, and the New Zealand economy is a host of pillars that are very hard to regulate. And until the cost of doing business with these monumental pillars, otherwise known as monopolies, is tamed, we're always going to be a high-cost economy.
Yeah, you wanted a Fonterra-style regulation back in the day. Looking at what we have got and what David Clark has announced, what would you like to concentrate on in terms of forcing a bit?
Well, I think if you want to encourage competition, you've got to require the existing supermarkets to provide access to the wholesale chain. Now, the existing supermarkets and other little grocery stores, they all have to buy their products from a certain source, and that's a wholesale market. And if it's dominated by the people who currently have inordinate influence in that chain of economic activity, then you're going to stop economic competition. But the sense that I have is that David Carter, Clark. David Clark, I'm running out of Davids, other than my old mate David Shearer, who is eminently more easy to deal with than David Cunliffe. But that aside, I think Dr. Clark, he has a good understanding. They just need to show pace, they need to show will, and be prepared to stand up. Because we were all let down by the Commerce Commission. I mean, I did get in the crap by calling the Commerce Commission a gummy old but that's basically
That's what it was.
The nature of their contribution. So I'm glad that the government has said to the Commerce Commission, not good enough.
But also, Shane, I think that the government wasted too much time waiting for the outcome. I think they should have pushed it along. And you've alluded to it, and I think it's actually a very salient point. What they have failed to do in terms of these reforms is to ensure that to the degree I think they'll be able to do it is the control of those wholesale and the supply chains, because that's where the real issue lies. Because fundamentally, the consumer and the supplier are getting screwed.
We've been talking about Māori supermarket chain for a long time. Māori, if you look at the economy now with honey and meat and dairy and the rest of it, does this make it easier for a third player?
Well, I think I would say to any element in Te Ao Māori, team up with someone who already has skin in the game. Arguably one of the best supermarket and most successful supermarket owners of New Zealand is Jason Witahira. He owns the Albany supermarket, which is a major investment. A major. And so I would encourage any group from within Māoridom to hook up someone like him. But look, I think this is going to be good for the owners of meat, the owners of milk, the owners of fish, and let's face it, Māoridom have substantial exposure to those food commodities, and if they can get a wee bit more out of the supermarkets, that's ka pai, but the supermarkets are going to have to yield some of their profit margin.
Let's go to the Pacific Island Forum. The 51st Pacific Islands Forum has kicked off, but Kiribati has withdrawn, followed by the Cook Islands PM and the Marshall Islands President. What's going on? What's going on in the situation there, Shane?
Well, I think you've got a country like Kiribati that I learnt just today of a population of 110. They've got a 110,000. Sorry, they've got a strategic sort of bit of land there, and where they're at. So I think they're holding off. They're going to see if they can get a better deal out of the Chinese or out of New Zealand and Australia. And to a certain degree, you can't blame them. There are people that by and large live in a subsistence economy. And I think that many of our chickens have come home to roost. Remember, and I've run this line for the last 3 or 4 weeks, in many regards, we're the bad actor in a lot of this. We were the colonists and still are. And I think it's just the Pacific playing their cards strategically and smartly. And at the end of the day, they have a responsibility primarily to their own people.
Shane, you were the ambassador to the Pacific Economic Pacific Economic Development. Tell us what your read is. You've got a better read than most.
Well, the forum is chaired this year by Frank Bainimarama, and it represents a redemption for Frank. Frank, you may recall, wanted New Zealand and Australia kicked out of the forum, and he resented the forum because the forum in 2009, when John Key was the Prime Minister, initiated by Helen Clark, expelled Fiji from the forum because they had suspended democracy in Fiji. Now, we can argue whether or not New Zealand overplayed their hand there, but the reality is he's now back in the fold. I think he'll be extraordinarily disappointed that under his chairmanship there's been this fracturing. Why is Kiribati stepping away? I think Kiribati is exercising their influence and they're participating now in a bidding war. They know that America is trying to re-engage. They know that Australia is the proxy for America in the Pacific, and they know that New Zealand, our specialty is soft diplomacy. We don't have the checkbook. But to do soft diplomacy, Mihi, you have to be on the road all the time, you have to have your dance card full, and you have to be continually boosting equity through trust and ongoing interaction. And we've dropped the ball in that regard. I think Kiribati are hoping that by remaining aloof, they will attract more international favour. They may follow through on their promise to get closer to China. That would be a very treacherous step if it has the effect of causing consternation with the Americans, who have a treaty with the Kiribati. When Kiribati became independent, Mihi, there was an American senator, a Republican, I forget the chap's name, who held out for many years because he feared that America's sphere of influence would be compromised if Kiribati became independent. So they signed a treaty enabling America to influence Kiribati's behaviour if the military or security dimensions of the United States of America were compromised by other relationship that Kiribati might make. So watch this space. I see lots of whitewater in this regard.
We've been told this is all about security. Have we just been too late to the have we taken our eyes off the ball?
Well, Shane is right. There's very little we can do in our own right. I think Australia's been a very poor player and quite aggressive to the Pacific, as they have New Zealand under Dutton and Morrison and the Conservative Prime Ministers before him. I think there is some hope. You've got a greater sort of political sync between Australia and New Zealand, Wong and Mahuta, and so I think they'll have to play this out a bit. Ardern, who has an international popularity and also is up in the Pacific, so I think that we're in a better position than we were a few weeks ago. But Shane's quite right. There's a lot of white water to sort of go, and the COVID has caused particularly economic pain to some of the smaller islands because of tourism.
Just quickly,
I mean, the real danger, Mihi, is that it has undermined their fiscal stability. And then when you're a small government and you're very isolated and your sources of income have been disrupted through COVID and other logistical dramas, you've got to look somewhere to keep fiscally robust and fiscally solvent. And until such time New Zealand can help resolve some of the fiscal pressures on these small nation states, they're going to cast their net wherever they think there is some lucrative fish.
And remember, for many of our island sisters and brothers, one of their main source of income is actually remittance. So not only are their economies hurting, but, if they've got a New Zealand whānau, Australian or American whānau, for that matter, who are able to sort of send koha, it causes real problems.
You mentioned fish, but you just mentioned it in a thing. But is it about resources? Is it about fish more than security?
Oh, look, one of the greatest resources in the El Dorado, which is 10 degrees above and 10 degrees below the equator, is the fisheries pelagic resource. It is the largest resource, fisheries resource in the world, wild fishery. And it's highly sought after. It is poorly policed, certainly in what's called the high seas. That refers to that part of the Pacific Ocean which is not within an economic zone of the island nation states. So the fisheries resource is very lucrative. It can be better managed, and until such time we get more stability up there and less geopolitical posturing, we're going to see a lot of diversionary politics from the islands.
Yeah, for many of the countries, the greatest political leverage they have are their fishing territories and the economic zones.
We're going to move on to something quite different. Te Matatini. It was Tuariki Delamere who first got the $1 million as Associate Minister of Finance back in 1996. It's increased by about another $1 million over 20 years. The Symphony Orchestra received nearly $20 million. The Royal New Zealand Ballet receives $8 million and Te Matatini 2.9. So when you look at the audiences reached for each of these three, Te Matatini leaves the others in the dust. But it's only giving about 1.3, I think it's $1.30 per audience view or something like that. What's going on? This is clearly inequity.
It is inequity. I do think we should have a national ballet. I do think we should have a national symphony orchestra, but I also think that Matatini ought to be valued. It ought to have more putia put into it. The reality is that our indigenous culture is a huge selling point internationally. And, perhaps what we could do something like fund Matatini, the winning organisation, the winning ropu at the sort of figures that the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra has and have them travel internationally. So I think that, there's an economic advantage in terms of supporting Matatini.
You've been in government. Almost every Māori politician's aligned to some winning kapahaka group. Why does it continue to be so poorly supported?
Just hasn't been prioritised. I think one of the most important ways to conceive Te Matatini is that it's structured, it requires commitment, and there's an obligation made, like most of our listeners of Māori descent who have had kids in kapahaka, it's not a walk in the park.
No.
There's a substantial amount of, in fact, when some of my kids were really little, we used to go to Manuariki. You may recall that was Mr. Phillips's centre near Taumarunui. Well, driving a van full of kids all the way from Auckland up to the chilly Taumarunui was not for the faint-hearted.
Especially that last 40 minutes. Especially that last 40 minutes.
Exactly. So, look, I think if you conceive of it in that regard, that you don't get there because it's cool to twirl a poi. You get there because you make a deep commitment.
Is it cultural elitism?
I think part of it is. And, an extra $6 million, so you have a national icon that, again, I think, can travel the Motu, travel the world. $7 or $8 million, literally, that's a drop in the bucket. Drop in the ocean.
Do you think that things might change a wee bit? I noticed the other day there was a story around Māori kaiawhina I te reo, their salary going from $21 an hour to 42 or something.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Do you think this might happen with kapahaka tunes?
I think it's. I was thinking about this the other day when some of the judges came to our marae and we had a church service and we welcomed Judge Taumonu, who I must say is a very impressive individual. Probably not quite as impressive as his sister, but that aside. And it seemed to me our marae is reasonably well served when certain whānau are there. But I think that the way to expand kapahaka is for each hapu and each marae through that treaty settlement process to actually get kaiapuna, to go from marae to marae, from school to school, and to ensure that each of those locations are able to conduct ceremony and process and procedure by teaching specific people who then can radiate their influence. And I think kapahaka is a good platform for doing that. It is a big commitment, and a lot of kapahaka people I find are absolutely committed to kapahaka. They're not interested in many other things, and that's how time-consuming and engrossing kapa haka is.
We just want to talk about the Māori Party AGM before we leave. They had a stunning lineup. Very young. Rob Ruha, Pani Newton, Julia Whaipoti, Safari Hines, the Hori, all movers and shakers in Te Ao Māori. Is that the future? I mean, are they in the run-in into the elections, are they looking good now?
I think they're looking okay. The problem they've got is they haven't got any runs on the board, and there's still that hangover in terms of their relationship with the National Party. Their current leadership seems sometimes a little bit flashy, a little bit gimmicky, but and have no runs on the board. Very interesting though that the president of the president of the Māori Party recently retook his role, and that was John Tamahiri. And so I thought that was a bit unusual if you were in fact looking at a generational shift.
But they have kind of got runs on the boards because they've got two seats, they've got two MPs, but. Do most political parties forget the fact that Māori are on average 25 years old? Are they looking in the right direction for votes?
Look, I could easily sit here and take pot shots at the Māori Party, but I've sort of moved beyond that. I welcome anyone who's willing to put their life on hold and have a crack seriously in public life. The Māori Party, in my view, are going to fight like cats and dogs to win some of the Māori seats. I suspect they'll line up Meka as they tried to line up Parikura in the past. And if they want to have influence, they need to win seats. I do not imagine Willie or the Labour Party will willingly yield those seats unless they feel the only way they can govern at the end of next year is by conceding some space to the Māori Party, given this generation of Māori Party are never going to share power with ACT.
Is that your what were your eyes on Te Tai Rāwhiti?
No, I'm not saying that Meka would lose, but if I was a strategist for the Māori Party, I'd go through all the polling data, and Shane Tapo knows this because he was an activist in the Labour Party when he was young. You've got to work out where your message will radiate, because they're never going to get there with the 5%. That's more the New Zealand First recipe. They need to win seats.
And
they'll try, I'm sure, in Tāmaki Makaurau. Who knows what?
They'd be pretty safe in Waiariki, though, wouldn't they? Pretty safe.
They'll hold Waiariki.
What about that one? So Debbie Ngarewa Peka.
Te Taihauru is vulnerable in terms of Labour, and if you just have a look at the last D9s, which is the it was the voting. It's Tamaki Makaurau, and I'm not going to announce it now, but I think there's going to be some very interesting movements in Tamaki Makaurau.
Go on.
Well. Okay, then I will. Well, because it's out there for everyone, isn't it? And,
it's on the block.
Mr. Henare is not keen to be a constituent MP. He wants to go on the list, so they'll have to get a very good candidate to go up against the Māori Party.
Are you hearing this on the Pai up north?
I think, look, a lot of us, and I had a big role in bringing Kelvin into politics. But a lot of us are suspicious or are suspecting that Kelvin may want to move on. So there'll be an open slather in the north. But I can announce Matua Shane Jones is not going to stand in the Taitokerau seat. So I'm not saying it for those selfish reasons.
Hearing it first here, everybody, on the Party People, all this change. So we're looking at the north, and we're looking at Tāmaki Makaurau, and we're looking at Te Tai Hauauru. What are we looking forward to this week in politics? Shane?
Well, look, the Prime Minister, I think, had a very good run internationally. The EU deal, the extension of the visas, the Australian deal, but she's got to come home and she's got to confront the only issue that most Kiwis are burdened with, and that's rising costs. So, great stuff overseas, but you got to come and face your own people, and that's the issue that the Prime Minister Ardern and her cabinet have to confront.
Do you agree?
I think it was unwise of Christopher Luxon to give that speech in London, which could be construed as dissing his own country. Keep your politics of a domestic nature.
Can you just elaborate for the audience?
Pardon?
Elaborate for the audience.
Christopher Luxon gave a speech in London where he basically said that New Zealand had got COVID wrong and that New Zealand businesses were soft. You don't talk like that. Right. When you go overseas, you talk about the finer virtues and finer sentiments of your nation. So that just shows his inexperience. The Prime Minister's going to have to work very hard with Grant Robertson to get back the territory that the polls show that that they're ceding and losing, but there's great virtue associated with incumbency.
Yes.
Why is it that as an opposition leader you're meant to not really diss your country?
Because it's a protocol, and some of the stuff that he was saying sort of wasn't actually true and accurate, and it was the clumsiness of it. And the guy's a week later, he's still trying to defend that position, and 3 weeks out from his abortion comments, he's still trying to defend those comments. This guy lacks agility, and I think he's got some own problems.
It's pretty
in terms
simple.
Of
you go
the message out.
overseas and you're a Kiwi aspirant to be the Prime Minister, you stick up for your country. You don't go over there and take cheap pot shots against your country and the people who are currently running
But there's
the
nothing
country.
stopping you.
Kia ora. That's Party People for this week. Ka nui te mihi ki te Puna Whakatongarewa mōna I tautoko I tēnei kaupapa. Don't forget you can watch us on RNZ's YouTube account.